We now have the third game with FSR 3, and its Avatar Frontiers of Pandora is the third time the charm for FSR 3. Early testing from other media outlets has shown that this has resolved some of the major issues we saw in the first two games released with FSR 3 frame generation. Initially, the issues were, number one, that variable refresh rate did not seem to function properly when FSR 3 frame generation was enabled. This is something I demonstrated on my channel, showing my LG TV's overlay, where it shows, its variable refresh rate syncing numbers, and then looking at the actual numbers in the game and noticing that they just don't seem to mesh at all. And then you can see like screen tearing and just frame pacing issues that seem to again suggest that it wasn't working properly. However, if you used VSync for frame pacing and were hitting your monitor's maximum refresh rate, the game could pace the frames fairly well, but it was then limited to relying on hitting your monitor's max refresh rate with VSync locked in order to get a pretty decent experience with frame generation in those first couple of releases. Now, the actual frames generated themselves could look pretty good and were pretty competitive with the quality of generated frames we were seeing from things like DLSS 3 frame generation. And now we have Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, where again, early testing from other media outlets has shown that it seems like it's now working with variable refresh rate and VSync on or off, no big deal. I'm going to try to confirm some of that, and also playing around a bit off camera, I've noticed a setting that might cause you problems. And so how do we avoid that issue to make you feel like this is not working as well as it should be? And let me go ahead and just jump in. I think we'll film the screen directly so I can show things like the LG TV's overlay, which couldn't be captured through like a screen capture. That'll allow us to look at the variable refresh rate reports and things like that. Also, I think filming the screen directly can be a better way to see what it's actually like to experience things like the frame pacing and screen tearing and things like that, rather than when you do like a software capture especially, or even a external capture card. At least my capture card doesn't go to 4K 120, so it's just not quite the same experience. Anyway, let's go ahead and hop in here, and I've got a couple of things to show you. Oh no, screen tearing. So I want to show you guys that if you turn on a common setting, you can actually seem to introduce some screen tearing into frame generation that doesn't need to be there. But this is such a common setting that I think I want to start the video with this, because if you think you're getting a bunch of screen tearing, like I don't know how much this is picking up in the video, because again, even filming the screen directly at 120 FPS, it's a variable refresh rate experience. YouTube will crush this down to 60 FPS when you see it. And again, locked frame rate versus variable frame rate. But the point is, I'm getting definite screen tearing in the bottom of the screen here, despite the fact that if you look at the top left corner of the screen, we are under my monitor's 120 FPS max refresh rate. So if VRR was working properly, we shouldn't see screen tearing. But the game won't actually default to this setting, but a lot of people will do this. This is what happens, I've noticed, when you set it to the exclusive full screen mode of the game. Now, the game defaults to borderless full screen, and if I go ahead and put it to borderless full screen and do this same camera pan in exactly the same area of the game, you'll notice that if we look at the screen tearing the image, it is buttery smooth. So, and again, how much of this picks up in YouTube, it's difficult for me to say. I'm doing the best I can with 120 FPS camera capture, crushed down to YouTube, it is what it is. But I can tell you to my eye, absolutely no screen tearing or runt frames or weirdness going on with this smooth camera pan. So, but again, I know that a lot of people feel like exclusive full screen modes are the way you want to play the game. You set that there, especially I think in non-DX12 games. It could definitely be true that sometimes that gets you a more responsive game, sometimes a better performance, that kind of a thing. Not sure if that's still as true with DX12 games, but the point is, I'm noticing, once again, if I switch to the exclusive full screen mode, we're going to get some screen tearing back. Once again, I'm seeing this shakiness at the bottom of the screen here. So some screen tearing that kind of a thing. So I don't think this is that big of a deal, but I do think it's something that people need to be aware of, or else, common settings that people use could end up screwing up their experience with frame generation. And so I just wanted to make sure that we are aware of that. So if you are getting a bad experience, perhaps switch to borderless full screen and you might get a better experience. Now, we were just looking at the image with frame generation on, and we can also compare this to frame generation off. And you'll see that with frame generation off, by the way, when you switch frame generation on and off, whatever overlay you're using to monitor performance will turn itself on and off. Here, I'm just using the Nvidia overlay. And by the way, I am running this on an RTX 4090 currently. Maybe we can look at some other GPUs in the video as well. But here's frame generation off. So you can see, again, still good frame pacing, but there's less detail between images. Now there is, right now we're on the default max settings of the game, so we do have some motion blur enabled. Perhaps we should turn that off to get the best look at things. There's a very complicated, very complex, detailed graphics menu here, which could possibly be a fun thing to delve a little bit further into at some point. But okay, we're gonna go motion blur off so we can see what the game looks like without any of that. So again, here we're looking at the game, no frame generation. We're getting between 50 to mid-60s frames per second, it looks like, depending on which way the camera is looking. If I go ahead and turn on my LG TV's overlay, which again is another reason why we're filming the screen directly, we can see G-Sync enabled, and we can see that the frame rate counter here pretty closely matching my software display for the frame rate count. And they don't update at exactly the same interval or anything, so they're not going to be a perfect match, but you can see that basically no frame generation enabled, and we are getting good variable refresh rate experience, no screen tearing, but you can see there's a bit of a blur to the image because you don't have detail in between the frames, right? So the idea then would be that hopefully kicking on frame generation will keep our good frame pacing, but add more detail between real frames. Again, I've got to toggle my frame rate counter back on here so you can see it again on the top left screen. Now, previously in other games, the frame rate counter with G-Sync enabled here would not always match what we were seeing on the other frame rate counter. Now, there's still not a perfect match exactly, but again, I think we're just closer to the monitor's max refresh rate, and you can see it bouncing around a little bit, and it's close to what we're seeing in the top left corner. The point is, it seems to actually be working now, and you can see that we are getting a pretty smooth frame pacing, and we are getting, apparently my controller is disconnecting or something. There we go. All right, so we're getting a fairly smooth camera pan. G-Sync is seeming to track the frame rate dips and things like that, and we are not getting that screen tearing. Again, as long as we're not in that exclusive full screen mode. Maybe we'll take another look at that one with the VRR display enabled, just for the fun of it, to see if we notice anything interesting or not. It actually looks like it is tracking the frame rate, so it doesn't seem to just be a VRR issue necessarily, but we are still getting that screen tearing. So somehow something's off there. Again, not quite sure exactly what it is, but yeah, avoid the exclusive full screen mode, at least on my setup, and I get a good result here with FSR 3 frame generation. Now, so far this was with scaling off, VSync off, all of that. Anyway, what should we do before we go ahead and leave the video? Should we try this out on probably an AMD GPU and see if we see the same issues with the full screen mode or not? That'll be interesting. Here I am on quick mouse movements and things like that. And again, I think things hold up very smoothly in motion. And by the way, this game, like, the jungles are just gorgeous. I haven't got to play much of the game yet, but like, as soon as you step out of the little initial human facility and pop out into the jungle world, man, it's really a visual treat. Anyway, let's pop into an AMD GPU and make sure we're seeing the same type of things. All right, I've popped in the RX 7800 XT, and this is the game. I did adjust the settings a bit because I'm still outputting to 4K resolution. We're starting out in borderless full screen. I am interested if AMD GPUs will have the same full screen kind of issue we saw. I dropped down to the high graphics preset and then turned off motion blur. We were on max settings, everything, when we were on the 4090. And we've got some upscaling enabled on the 4090. We did not. We had scaling quality set to off. Here we're at the balanced settings because I'm trying to get a high enough base frame rate for frame generation to have a good chance, but currently frame generation off. So frame generation off, you can see here my monitor is variable refresh rate through FreeSync correctly. You can see the FPS counter through AMD's software overlay up here. And let's go ahead and kick on frame generation. So we will kick frame generation on. Now, one reason why I'm using AMD's software overlay here is when you turn frame generation on and off, it kills most other software overlays like MSI Afterburner and things like that. So you can see here, I'm giving it a chance to kind of stabilize, that our frame rate has gone up considerably. In this scene, we're actually hitting my monitor's 120 FPS cap much of the time. However, if I look in a more difficult to render direction, we can see we're dropping, into the 99 to 100-ish range. And again, while the latency, but like the intervals that those sync at can be a little bit different, it does look like it is doing a variable refresh rate job, right? It's not just kicking to the monitor's max refresh rate and staying there. So even if those don't perfectly match up, you get the idea. Camera pan looks fairly smooth. I'm not seeing screen tearing on it. One thing I will mention, though, is there's a bit of just judder, as I think the frames are easier to render in certain areas than others, and I don't think that that's frame generation doing that. I think that's just the game in this scene doing that, because even with frame generation set to off, it's not a perfectly smooth camera pan. Where in some areas it feels like the camera jumps forward at times. So that seems to be an issue with the game in this scene, with frame gen both on and off. So that doesn't seem to be caused by frame generation. It does seem like frame generation increases the detail in between frames like it's supposed to. Now let's try out the full screen mode, because again, on the Nvidia GPU, we were seeing some issues with that, with frame generation on. And let's go ahead and see if we can see any of that screen tearing I was noticing on the Nvidia GPU. And, if it's there, okay, it might be there. I think I am seeing a little bit of screen tear here. Yeah, so it's definitely presenting differently than it did on the 4090, but again, we're running at different frame rates than the 4090 was, so I think it would present slightly differently. But I do feel like I'm getting the occasional screen tear. Now, is it just when I'm passing the 120 FPS on the monitor? I'm curious if it's just a VSync cap issue, because when we're looking in this direction, we can go over the 120 FPS, for example, if I'm staring straight down. And I'm definitely getting screen tearing when that happens. Let's go ahead and actually reduce the base frame rate by taking our upscaling down to the, up to the quality setting, which will reduce our base frame rate a bit. And so maybe now we won't go over the monitor's max refresh rate. I'm curious if I'll still see any screen tearing on it in this full screen mode. Now notice I should probably talk about this. The HUD elements like this with that blur effect, those don't properly get processed. Like, do you see how bad that looks? That's my main issue with this game, is just that HUD element. You can see when that's gone, things are looking a lot better. Here I'm maybe not seeing the screen tearing now that we're staying under the monitor's max refresh rate. And again, that was not the case on the 4090. So again, I don't know exactly what's going on with these settings, but it seems like at least on these two GPUs that the full screen mode is working a bit better on my AMD GPU than it was on the Nvidia GPU. However, that doesn't I don't think this is a big enough sample size, and I'm not a big enough expert on VSync and all of those things to tell you guys exactly what's happening. Looks like our frame rates took a big hit when I switched over to borderless full screen mode. Let's give it a second to kind of process. All right, I think it has kicked in correctly now. Yeah, so anyway, overall, it's looking like we're getting frame generation working out correctly here with, again, the frame pacing issues, variable refresh rate issues seem to be working a lot better here than we saw in other games. And once again, overall with this implementation, I think my main issue is, like I said, just the HUD elements. So when I get these things up here and then in motion, you can see that that's processing significantly differently than everything else is. And so that's really kind of the only annoying thing I'm seeing about the frame generation right now. If we turn frame generation off, let's see how that processes to see if it's just an upscaling issue or a frame generation issue. Yeah, it seems like that processes more correctly without frame generation on. So that seems to be the biggest issue, is those HUD elements. Other than that, though, I think the overall FSR implementation in this game looks fairly good. Again, if I'm not talking about frame generation, but just the upscaling in general. But if we go to something more aggressive like performance mode, I still think we do get a enough loss of detail in motion that it can be a bit distracting, especially, again, if you see things like as the character's arms move and things like that. So there's still the general kind of fizzling and disocclusion imperfections that we usually see with FSR, but given the amount of foliage going on here and the amount of flicker that you can often get on foliage with FSR implementations, I do think this is one of the best handlings of that I've seen. But still, as there's disocclusion across certain things, like you still do get some pixelation and things like that. So I still think a DLSS upscaling can look better. So you'll have to make the choice on, do you want the better upscaling or do you want the frame generation turned on? Because the game doesn't seem to offer DLSS 3 frame generation. All right, guys, I think I'm going to end it here for today. I don't know if you guys could tell during the video that my energy level's kind of low. I'm actually homesick today. I don't feel well at all. So I would love to do a lot more with this and screen captures and other GPUs, 10 series, 30 series, all of that. I think at this point, honestly, energy level's done. I was interested in taking a look at this, and especially wanted to mention that screen tearing thing. Again, interesting that I'm seeing that full screen mode, at least on my 4090, causing some issues. Borderless full screen seems to be fine. Overall thoughts here are it does seem to be a major improvement to FSR 3 frame pacing, which is a huge deal because the whole point of frame generation technologies is to increase the smoothness of the visual presentation of the game. And, because they don't increase the game's responsiveness the way normal frame rate increases do. So the whole point is increasing the visual smoothness, so having the frame pacing and variable refresh rate issues seemingly fixed is a really big deal for this technology. Overall, going forward, there's two main things that I want to see from FSR 3. Number one, get into more games, because right now it's in the initial two launches are in games that, quite frankly, if you look at any sort of like Steam hardware numbers or what, not hardware numbers, but Steam stats or whatever, very few people are playing Immortals of Avium and Forspoken. Avatar, we'll have to see. The game just came out. We'll see how popular it is. But yeah, get into more games. The other thing is, I think the base upscaler I would still like to see improved to be more in line with what DLSS is able to do. And you know what? It'd be awesome to see it even better than that, right? Because DLSS isn't perfect either. So yeah, base upscaler improvements. This game seems to be a pretty good implementation, but it's still not perfect. And I do think the DLSS upscaler still does look better. But anyway, those are the main things I'd like to see improved. The other thing that I would be interested in is if frame generation could be separated from FSR upscaling. Oftentimes in games with DLSS 3 frame generation, you can turn frame generation on even if for some reason you wanted to be using FSR upscaling or something like that, whereas FSR 3 frame generation does seem to be tied into the FSR pipeline. Now, I don't know if it's just programmed in that way and it just kind of has to be and can't be separated out. But I'm sure, NVIDIA's 20 and 30 series users would love to kind of have the option to use DLSS upscaling with AMD's frame generation on top of it. But of course, I doubt AMD cares too much about that particular setup. Understandably, I get it, but it would be nice for the end users of 20 and 30 series GPUs to have that option available, because right now you're forced to kind of choose between the better upscaler with no frame generation or the worse upscaler with frame generation. But anyway, it kind of is what it is, and I do think it's awesome that AMD is getting this to run on Nvidia GPUs as well as AMD GPUs, and regardless of the GPU series and all of that. So that is really cool. And it'd be also cool if maybe Nvidia could respond and make some version of their frame generation available on GPUs other than their 40 series. But we'll have to see what happens with any of this. I'm going to go ahead and edit this thing together and take a nap. I hope all of you have an excellent day.